Let me begin by yielding to my wife. Sherry's got an announcement.
Just aware of a couple of needs in our community. I was over at Salvation Army this afternoon, and they've got empty shelves. And so they need some food. And they actually are having one of their distributions tomorrow, starting at 9 o'clock. So they're going to run out. There's no doubt. And then Audrey, I asked Audrey if I could share this. She had sent a group me saying with the shutdown of the government, children at City Youth are facing times of not having enough food. They'll be out of school for a week at Thanksgiving, which takes away breakfast and lunch for them. At City Youth, we'd like to make bags of food for those who ask for help, as they have already helped. We've already helped a couple. Here is a list of food that we're getting together. They want you to drop the donation off at City Youth, or if you wanted to give a monetary donation, you could give that to Audrey, or I can collect it and give it to her. But it's basically your staple items, right? The non-perishables. You can imagine it's one of the things is evaporated milk, and at our women's meeting, I wouldn't have thought of this, but they use it for their cereal. It's it doesn't perish, and so it's a good thing. They water it down to have as milk, and so I would that's not what I was thinking they were using evaporated milk for, but you macaroni and cheese and hamburger helper and you name it, non-perishable, they need it. And so like I said, you could take it to City Youth, or if you want to do a monetary donation, Audrey would take it, or I'll take it to Audrey. So, thanks.
All right, thank you, Sherry. Tonight we're going to look at I'll put it like this. We're going to set up and begin to look at the story of Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. There's, this story is one of the longer stories, one of the longer episodes in John's gospel. And for any gospel writer, when you notice how long the story is, and remember, they could not write a book of interminable length. Basically, the reason all our gospels are about the same size, if you ever wondered, is because that's the maximum, that's the biggest book you could produce in a papyrus roll. Any bigger, it would get unwieldy and it would begin to fall apart. So when the gospel writers are writing, they have a sense of almost like you might say a word count deadline. And therefore, when a gospel writer spends a lot of time on an episode, John, you hear his a little bit of exasperation in the gospel when he says, so many things that could have been written. There's so much that could have been written. So when they're using a lot of paper, you might say, to tell a story, it's really, really important to them. And some of the most important parts of John's gospel are this story, the episode of the man born blind, the sixth sign. The seventh sign is the longest sign story. And then the farewell discourse that goes for several chapters, where if you got a red letter edition, you see it. It's just a lot of red, starting in chapter 13, the end of chapter 13, all the way up through chapter 17, the farewell discourse. Not to mention the fact, of course, that the events of the Passion Week are really important. And in all Gospels, that takes up the majority of the narrative, is the last week of Jesus' life. So this story is really, really important. And what we're going to talk about, we will just begin to approach this tonight, because there's a lot of background work we got to do. But we'll especially look at it a week from tonight. Why was this so important to John? Why would this be so important to his readers, his listeners? Because most people were illiterate, so they would have heard this gospel read to them. And then, does that translate to today? Is this episode, this story, equally important to us? If so, or if not. All right, so that's kind of where we're headed with this. So by way of background, I want to point out three things. First, and it'll take up half of our time tonight. just to give you a fair warning. First, the way I see this episode operating in John's gospel with regards to the outline is that Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman provides a commentary of his critique with the Sadducees in regard to his clearing the temple and declaring basically he's going to destroy and build the temple. So this idea of temples that are destroyed and temples are rebuilt, and where, where should you go to worship God and which temple, that's going to come up in this episode. So Jesus' response to the Samaritan woman is in part an explanation for his beef with and the significance of his actions in John chapter 2, where he clears the temple. And the long and the short of it is this. The answer is, of course, as we've already talked about this, you see it in John 1:14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And that word is skeuo, which means tabernacle. It's temple language. He tabernacled among us. And of course, you know that between the tabernacle and the temple. The tabernacle was the mobile sanctuary of God that was intended to move about the tribes of Israel so that all 12 tribes would know that God would visit them. So God would come to them. Now, when the tabernacle was first brought into the land with Joshua's conquest, it stayed at Shechem, Sychar, the very city where the Samaritan woman is. All right, so that's crucial to the story, the episode. And yet, even though it was at Shechem, it would move about. You can read about it. They would move it up here, and so the northern tribes could, experience the presence of God. They would move to the south. And of course, the tabernacle eventually was moved permanently to Jerusalem. By whom? David. Why? Why Jerusalem? Sorry? Yeah, it's on a hill, yes. Well, Shechem was, Mount Gerizim was a hill too, but there's something else going on here. Why did David want to move the tabernacle to that hill, to Mount, I can't even know Mount Zion, but Mount Moriah? What was so important about Jerusalem? Yeah, it's in Judah, yes. What else? That was his city. Why was it his city, Stan? Very good. Yes. He defeated, they were defeated earlier, but he led a campaign to get rid of the Jebusites. They were pushed out of that area, finally under David. David was very successful. Of course, there was battles against the Jebusites, and he declared that mountain, that city, he wanted it to be his administrative capital of his kingdom. To put it in our language, he wanted it to be his Washington, D.C. Okay, it's the capital. And one of the things about David's kingdom was the question, and I didn't intend to go down this path, but still, it's just so interesting to me. Was David's kingdom legitimate? Or a better way of asking it is, was David's claim to the throne recognized as legitimate from the very beginning by all 12 tribes? No. Why? Why would they go, what makes you think you should become the king? What would be their question? Why? Because actually what happened was he was anointed by Samuel first. Then he was the prophet. Then he was anointed by the elders of Judah, his tribe. But it was until later that he was finally anointed and recognized by all 12 tribes, the other 11, as the king over all of Israel. So the question is, why did it take him so long? I mean, if God's choice was through Samuel and he's still a boy, why would it take them so long to recognize that David is indeed to be the king of Israel? Okay, that's an interesting take on it, yeah. Oh, yeah, people are stubborn.
Did it have anything to do with Saul?
Yes. What would it have to do with Saul, Jackie?
Well, Saul had been the king
Mm-hmm.
and he had sons,
Yes.
and
And therefore one would expect royal succession.
his sons to
Because we talk about sons of David, how come we don't talk about sons of Saul? Like God recognized Saul as the king. It wasn't God's idea, the way the story unfolds. It's the people's idea. As a matter of fact, Samuel thinks it's a bad idea. As a matter of fact, Samuel thinks it's a theologically illegitimate idea because God's supposed to be their king. God's their king. They don't need a man. God sits on the throne. He's their king. And yet the people want a king because they compare themselves to all these other nations who have kings. They go to Samuel and say, we want a king. Samuel says, this is a horrible idea. God, they want a king. This is ridiculous. God goes, let it be. When you find yourself in times of trouble, I don't know. I don't know where that came from. But anyway, let it be. God says, God basically, this is my paraphrase, obviously, we'll make this work. So God anoints Saul. He is victorious in his campaigns. But for some reason, and do you remember the reason? God says, I'm done with Saul. And what would that mean for Jonathan, who would have been in line to be king? It means, but why was God unhappy with Saul? Jonathan would have been unhappy, and yet strangely enough in the story, Jonathan loved David and wanted David to be king.
Well, David was married to Saul's daughter.
Yes, Michael, that's right. But again, what did Saul do? I didn't plan to do this.
Spoils of the war. God, when he took spoils and allowed some of the.
He offered sacrifices in place of the priest.
So these things start piling up. The whole thing about keeping some of the spoils of war, he was not supposed to. He wants to go to war with the Philistines. I think it's the Philistines. Can't remember which it is. Maybe it is the Philistines. And everyone knows that when these nations go to battle with one another, it's the battle of the gods. It's the gods are going to duke it out, and the battle will reveal who is the superior God. Whether God is El Shaddai, God Almighty. So what you got to do is, before the war starts, you ever wonder why they kind of line up and wait? They line up, and you see smoke going up behind the front line of the soldiers on each side. And what they're doing is the priests are there offering sacrifices, trying to see if their God says, yes, let's go to war. Yes, let's go to war. And of course, the priests of Aaron had Urim and Thummim, right? These, whatever they were, rocks in a pouch that helped them to divine whether or not God says yes or no. So they would sacrifice, because no soldier would go into war unless he believed God was on his side. Because it's a battle of his God against their God. All right? They keep waiting on the priest to show up, and he won't show up, and he won't show up, and Saul says, forget it, I'll do it myself. And it's after that, culminated with the whole spoil, God goes, I'm done with you, I'm going to choose someone else, and he chooses David. Strangely enough, God makes the promise to David that he will have a son that will inherit the throne forever. Okay. All of that is running through the pages of the New Testament, the Son of David. That context is part of the context of David wanting to build the temple in Jerusalem. God says, no, I'm not going to let you do that because it's a tabernacle. But God doesn't object that I don't want a permanent structure here. Why does God tell David, no, I'm not going to let you build a temple that's permanent in Jerusalem? You shed too much blood. Your son will do it. So, although it was David's idea to move the tabernacle to Jerusalem, it was God's idea to allow the temple to be there permanently. And as you know anything about the geography of Israel, Jerusalem is in the southern part of the land. So what would that mean for the people of the north? A long way to get to worship God. In David's city. God lives in his city. That's a divine stamp of approval. All right? So this question about where do you go to worship God, there's echoes of that, and I'll pick up more of that Well, I might as well do that now. So this is the second thing I want to talk about as a background, and that's this. When Solomon's temple was destroyed by Zerubbabel, not by Nebuchadnezzar, and 70 years later, Zerubbabel rebuilds the temple. About that time or a little later, the descendants of the northern kingdom, Israel, who were known as people of Samaria, there is Judea and Samaria and Galilee, the Samaritans, who were the descendants of the northern kingdom, these Samaritans built a temple to God on Mount Gerizim, which was really close to Shechem. So in fact, you may not know this, but the Samaritans have, even to this day, their own version of the law of Moses. 5 books of law. Yeah, it's different, very different in places from the law of Moses we have that Judah preserved for us, which is in our Bible. So the Samaritans had their own Pentateuch. They had their own temple to God, the God of Israel. They're descendants of Abraham. And they built a temple on Mount Gerizim. And we think it was built around, about maybe the 4th century BC. About 100 to 200, about 200 years later, 2nd century BC, the Hasmoneans, who are the Maccabean kings, were able to achieve independence for the southern kingdom, Judah, not the north, the Samaritans. And these people of Judah were ruled by these Hasmonean Jews who were neither, they were not descendants of Judah. They were not of the tribe of Judah. They were actually of the tribe of Levi. They were priests. Judas Maccabees, you heard about them. Hanukkah was built around the dedication of the temple after it was, impure by Antiochus Epiphanes. But anyway, so that started the Maccabean War. Well, for 100 years, Israel kind of reclaimed its independence. They called themselves Israel, but it was Judah, the land Judah. About the 2nd century BC, I think it's like in the 120s, a Hasmonean prince, John Hyrcanus, got wind that, they decided that God can't have 2 temples, because the temple that Zerubbabel built was in Jerusalem, in his domain, and the Samaritans had their temple at Mount Gerizim. So John Hyrcanus, and they were constantly involved in civil war, fighting the Samaritans and the Judeans, the Hasmoneans. He sent soldiers up secretly, and they destroyed the temple on Mount Gerizim. Destroyed it. Because they were stronger and had a bigger army. The Samaritans were so upset with the Judeans, these Jews, that the following year, I think I've told you this story before, they decided to sneak into Jerusalem just before the Passover. We'll wait till we get the phone done. Do we have it, Janice?
I'll have to find it. Now, I thought I left it in the car, didn't I?
Okay. So the following year decided to sneak into Jerusalem, these Samaritans, just before Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And they raided the tombs around Jerusalem and dragged corpses, dead bodies, out of the tombs and strewn them along the streets of the old city, Jerusalem, which rendered Jerusalem unclean, and therefore they could not celebrate Passover as revenge for destroying their temple. Because the Samaritans believed they were the true sons of Abraham, the northern kingdom. The Hasmoneans of the Judah, they believed they were the true sons of Abraham, the true Israel. So 200 years before Jesus, 200 years before Paul, there were sons of Abraham that argued who's true Israel and who's not. language or a conflict you see in the Gospels between Jesus and different Jewish parties, as well as in Paul, his letters. Okay, so that sets up the conversation. Can you hear echoes when the Samaritan woman comes to Jesus and basically says, well, I know Messiah's coming. She's talking about the Samaritan Messiah, who they believe would be Moses come back from the dead. God promised Moses in Deuteronomy 18, I'm going to send a prophet just like you. So the Samaritans had their own version of the law of Moses, and they believed that the Messiah who was coming would be Moses redivivus. Moses come back from the dead to be the Messiah. So when she says, I know that Messiah is coming, she's talking about a Samaritan Messiah. And when she asks the question, where are we supposed to worship God, on your mountain or our mountain? Hear it? This is the context for this dialogue between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. Third, take your Bibles, turn to Genesis chapter 24. Scholars debate this a little bit, but I'm convinced with those who believe that because of this story in Genesis 24, and because of the story in Genesis 29, and because of the story in Exodus 2, you can look up all three of these stories, Genesis 24, Genesis 29, and Exodus 2. Basically, these stories capture the idea, or at least reveal the idea, that if you were a young woman hoping to get hitched to a man, of course, marriages were arranged. But as you know, there are only so many men to go around in a little community. And so if you're looking for a man, then the watering hole, the well, was the place where young men and young women could meet. Because the women would go there at night, just before the sun would set, and they would draw water for the next day. It was their job. And the men would show up, the boys would show up to try to make connections. In other words, this watering hole, as you might say today, it's like it's, maybe not today. In my day, they said that's what the bars were for. Singles would go to the bars. So this is like their bar, except there's no alcohol involved. And these stories, in other words, what echoes in these stories is the theme of wedding bells. Remember, John the Baptizer said, a bridegroom is coming, remember? And I'm just the best man. And he only says that. John doesn't talk that way, the baptizer, in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, but he talks that way in John. And scholars think John is setting up this episode based on this story we're about to read. And you're going to hear echoes of around a watering hole, Jacob's well, where a man and a woman, there's talk of a relationship. John the Baptizer has prepared the bridegroom who's come to look for his bride. And I'm convinced, I write about this in Spirituality According to John, I'm convinced that's what John's doing, is he's setting up a bridal story between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. Why? Here's why. So I know this is a bit long, but we'll read it. In Genesis 24, Abraham's old, we're told, verse 1, because he's really old when he had Isaac. And he doesn't want his son to marry any old woman, any girl. He wants a girl from his extended family. So he sends one of his servants to go back to the homeland, because now, Abraham's a wandering Aramean, and he's wandering around that land that God's promised to his descendants. He sends this servant back to his homeland up in Mesopotamia to look for a bride for his son. Now, I want you to notice, and when I'm done reading it, I want you to notice the echoes with John 4's story. All right? Here we go. So picking up with verse 10. The servant took 10 camels from the camels of his master, set out with a variety of good things of his master's in his hand. He arose, went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. And he made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water at evening time, the time when women go out to draw water. And he said, O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today. Show loving kindness to my master Abraham. Behold, I'm standing by the spring. The daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now may it be that the girl to whom I say, please let down your jar so that I may drink. And he who answers, drink, and I will water your camels also. May she be the one whom thou hast appointed for thy servant Isaac. And by this I shall know that thou hast shown loving kindness to my master. And it came about before he had finished speaking this prayer. Behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Meliah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor, came out with her jar on her shoulder. The girl was very beautiful, a virgin. No man had had relations with her. She went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. The servant ran to meet her and said, please, give me a drink of the little water from your jar. She said, drink, my lord. She quickly lowered her jar to her hand and gave him a drink. Now, when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, I will draw also for your camels until they have finished drinking. So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough, ran back to the well to draw, and she drew for all those camels. Meanwhile, the man was gazing at her in silence to know whether the Lord had made his journey successful or not. Then it came about that when the camels had finished drinking it, the man took a gold ring weighing a half shekel and 2 bracelets for her wrists, weighing 10 shekels in gold. By the way, it always comes down to jewelry, doesn't it? I mean, the engagement ring's a big deal, even back then. And said, whose daughter are you? Please tell me. Is there room for us to lodge in your father's house? And she said to him, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Meliah, whom she bore to Nahor. Again, she said to him, we have plenty of both straw and feed and room to lodge in. And the man bowed low and worshiped the Lord. And he said, blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his loving kindness and his truth toward my master. As for me, the Lord has guided me in the way to the house of my master's brothers. Then the girl ran home and told her mother's household about these things. Okay, there's a very similar story, similar elements in Genesis 29 between Jacob and Rachel. You know, when Jacob sees Rachel and he's so overwhelmed by her beauty, and they're by a well, and he lifts the capstone so the sheep can be watered, and he seizes the moment after he wrestles that rock all by himself, and walks up to Rachel, kisses her, and then weeps. How romantic. That's Genesis 29. Very similar stories. She runs home to tell her father about this man, who is Laban, of course, the famous Laban. And a similar story shows up in Exodus 2 when Moses comes to a well and helps women water their sheep and ends up marrying the girl there, who happens to be the daughter of Jethro, who becomes his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. These stories keep bouncing through. So by the time you get to John chapter 4, are you hearing these resonances? The bridegroom, the best man, only basically prepares for the bridegroom when he comes. There's wedding bells, you might say, at the end of chapter 3 in John the Baptizer's analogy. The question about where do you worship God comes up with the Samaritan woman, with all the baggage between the Samaritans and the Judeans going 200 years before Jesus. The story of how Abraham's servant found Rebekah for Isaac. And again, Jacob and Rachel, and then Moses and Zipporah. Here we go. So what were the similarities in the story? Obviously, it happens at a well. What else? Anybody? Jesus asked for a drink. Do you hear the emphasis on the woman's marital status in both stories? Now we're going to have comparison, but we're going to have contrast as well. Anything else?
Woman runs from the well to the
Her home,
home.
runs back to her people and says, "Come meet the man." Rachel does that. Rebecca does that.
Well, Jesus and the Samaritan woman, that's the inequity of that. I mean, isn't she so much more below?
Yeah. Now we talk about comparisons. This story is coming at us with your typical like, look, this is the same story. It's happening again, and yet there's a twist, isn't there? There's the contrast. The difference is, in this case, it's a Jew and a Samaritan. It's at Jacob's well, but it's a Jew, a single man, who's looking for a woman, yes, but what kind of woman? You know, what kind of woman would Jesus look for? He's a single man. Is he looking to marry a wife? No. I mean, so what kind of woman is he looking for? I think he's looking for women disciples. So you hear the resonance of, we even talk about in Revelation, it's in Revelation, a work of John, of the marriage feast of the Lamb, yes? Where the church is described as the bride, the disciples of Jesus are described as the bride. The difference also is her marital status. Both of them are single women. She's a Samaritan, not of Jesus' family. She's not a Jew. And she's had 5 husbands. She's not known a man. She's known 5 men, and the one she's with now is not her husband. And yet Rebecca is single and also, but has not known a man. So there's these interesting comparisons and contrasts that set up this story, where I think John's presenting Jesus as a son of Jacob at Jacob's well, who's looking for a different kind of woman. Because, and the way I read the text is that she ends up being a better disciple of Jesus than the 12 men who went to the town to get food for him. As a matter of fact, I think she's an ideal disciple. I call her the ideal evangelist because she brings the whole city. Because she even recognizes he's not a single man looking for the kind of relationship that typically single men are looking for. He's looking for something else. And it all circles around water. By the way, a water jar is mentioned in both stories. It all circles around a well and water, and a conversation between Jesus and a woman about who's the Messiah and what does it mean to truly worship God, right? Questions about that before we read the story? Right, there's the contrast again. So he wants water, just like the other, and she's willing to give him water, but she's reluctant. She asks, "Why would you ask me for water? You're a Jew, I'm a Samaritan." And then all of a sudden it switches, where she's a woman who's known 5 men as husbands, and the one she's with now is not her husband. Whatever that means, we'll talk about that when we get into the story. But that Jesus then begins to offer her water. Yeah. So comparison, contrast all the way through. It's set up beautifully by John. Any questions about it?
So do you think, as this is fleshing out before John, and maybe the other disciples as well, they're hearing echoes of the stories they've heard.
I don't think they did at that point because they're in the town.
Oh, right, okay.
They're not there. But it makes it.
As he, you know.
Yeah, I think John began to, like so many stories, and even the signs, with time he began to think about what happened, and before you know it, he's finding double entendre constantly. He's finding symbols. He's finding signs that point in a direction more than just Jesus performing a miracle. For John, everything Jesus says and does points to who he is. So everything Jesus says, Jesus talks on two levels at the same time, an earthly level and a heavenly level at the same time. But of course, what he wants, as he's talking about water and drink and insatiable thirst that can be quenched, okay? He's trying to get her to come up here to talk about a different kind of water. He's trying to get her to see a different kind of Messiah. He's trying to get her to see a different kind of way to worship God. It's not on your mountain. It's not on my mountain. Can you hear it? So this double entendre worked. That happens all the time in John's gospel, all the time. Jesus is always pointing to something higher than what he's talking about, always. So John, I think with time went, oh. Like, go back to chapter 2, when he clears the temple and he says, destroy this temple in 3 days, I'll erase it. And they're confused. You see it in the Synoptic Gospels. They think he's talking just about the destruction of the Jewish temple. And that's why they can crucify him on Thursday, rather on Friday, convinced he's a false prophet because he cleared the temple either on a Sunday or Monday. Well, that's at least 3 days, and the temple's still standing. He's a false prophet. Crucify him. They're convinced. But John comes along and says, well, in the Synoptic Gospel, they go, that was false testimony. He never said he would destroy it in 3 days. He didn't say that. But in John's Gospel, he says, destroy this temple. Not that he would. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I will raise it. And then John adds, he's talking about, hear it, the temple of his body. And then the narrator adds, and they didn't figure that out until after the resurrection. So you get all these kind of hindsight references in John's gospel where they go, you can hear him constantly looking back. And I think this episode is another example of hindsight. He hears the baptizer say, I'm not the bridegroom. I'm preparing the way for the bridegroom. I got to get out of the way because he's looking for a bride. Here's what John assumes. He assumes the stories of the Hebrew Scriptures are bouncing around in your head every time you read anything in his gospel. Of course, our problem is we don't read the Old Testament, so we don't have these stories. Why don't we read the Old Testament? Why don't we know it well? Because we're a bunch of Gentiles, bluntly. Sherry just said, I said, how'd the study go in Hebrews? She did this study with the women's ministry. And she just said, it's gone really well. And I said, what was it? Was it your teacher who did an excellent job, or was it the richness of the sermon the preacher preached that we call Hebrews? Or was it both? And she said both. In particular, she kept taking us back, as the preacher does, to the Old Testament to show us how these things are coming true in Jesus over and over and over again. Matthew does it in his gospel. Paul does it in his letters, just about most of them.
When we were touring Israel, Adrian kept going back.
That's right. That's right. And in my own study, when you keep seeing how Jesus is the fulfillment of every promise God made to Israel, that the stories that were more than just acts of God in the past, but that this is family history. They're telling their family stories like we do when we gather around the table at holidays. We talk about the crazy uncle. We talk about your grandpa. We tell these family stories. When Israel gathers around their table for holiday, Passover, They're telling stories about their ancestors. Their great, 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 great. It's their family history they're telling. Keeping the stories alive. And we Gentiles, Paul kept trying to convince us in his letters, look, this is your family history too. You're children of Abraham too. Because Christ is the seed of Abraham that fulfills every promise. So Jesus walks around as the embodiment of the story of Israel. He's the embodiment of it. I could go on and on about that, but I'll stop right there. Yeah, he's the embodiment of Israel's story. And therefore, he's the resolution of Israel's story. He's the fulfillment. All things are fulfilled in him. So if we, according to Paul, are grafted in the olive tree, if we are in Christ because of our faith, that's just like Abraham. We believe a promise, and Jesus is a promise, and we're grafted in. We are in Christ. Then old things pass away. Our Gentile past is irrelevant, and now we are the Israel of God. But that doesn't mean you have to become a Jew, right? Keep the law, because Jesus fulfilled it. Wow, didn't plan to do that, but that helps, I think. This is an embodiment of the story of Israel. Again, it happens over and over again. Okay, I'm going to take us, I just want to read the story up through verse 26. Make a few comments, open it for questions, and then we'll finish the rest of this episode. By God's grace, we'll finish it next Wednesday. When therefore the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John. That's the very thing, that caused the problems in chapter 3 between John's disciples and Jesus' disciples. Although Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, he left Judea, departed again into Galilee. He had to pass through Samaria. You're going from Judea to Samaria. You're going to pass through Samaria unless you divert and go down and up the Jordan Valley and try to go around Samaria. So he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, Shechem, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. In John's gospel, John relies upon Roman time. You see it in the crucifixion. Okay, so the 6th hour in Roman time is either 6 a.m. or 6 p.m., the same time that women go to the well. So I heard sermons, she was there by herself at noon. No, she wasn't. She was there at night. And at this time, she's a woman who happens to be there. So he's weary from his journey. He sits by the well. It's about the 6th hour. It's about 6 p.m., just sunset. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman therefore said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I'm a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." We know why. We just talked about it, don't we? They hate one another. Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God, and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." She said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and this well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? You are not greater than our father Jacob." Hear it? Our father. She's a son of Jacob, a daughter of Jacob. "Are you, who gave us the well, drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle?" Jesus answered and said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water shall thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall become in him a well of water," remember this, "springing up to eternal life." The woman says to him, "Sir, give me this water so I will not be thirsty, nor come all the way here to draw." He says to her, "Go call your husband. Come here." She answers, "I have no husband." He says, You've said, well, I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. This you have said truly. And then my favorite line of the whole story, the woman says, Sir, I perceive you're a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain. You people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem shall you worship the Father. You worship that which you do not know. We worship that which we know, for salvation is from the Jews. By the way, the word in Hebrew, salvation, is Yeshua, Jesus. So it's a pun here. He's basically saying Jesus is from the Jews, because Jesus' name means salvation. But an hour is coming, and now is, when true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit. Those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming. He's called the Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us. Jesus said to her, I am the one speaking to you. Is he? I am he. So at that point, of course, the disciples come and the woman leaves her water pot. Verse 38, or 28, she leaves her water pot and goes to the city and says, come see the man who told me all the things that I've done. Is this is not the Christ, is it? Okay. All right, there's so much going on in this text to get to this point, but I at least wanted to set up the context for, or make a few observations about this part of the story. It's fascinating to me that Jesus decides he needs to leave Judea because the Pharisees have heard that he's making and baptizing more disciples than the baptizer.
Sorry about that.
Everybody has talking phones. It happens on Sunday morning. It happens on Wednesday night. That's all right.
I was at least on the right verse.
Yeah, well, that's right. That's right. And by the way, Arliss is the one who, if you weren't there in the first service, his phone just started, talking religiously about. And then he came up afterward and he just kind of said, I'm sorry. And I go, hey, come to think of it, if I were quicker on my feet, I would have said, you know what Arliss is doing? He's saying, oh, you think that sermon's good? Listen to this. So there's something going on here that the Pharisees and their disciples, Jesus and his disciples, John and his disciples are in competition. There's a sense of a competitive spirit between them. And I'll talk a little bit more about this next time, but I'm convinced, I agree with scholars who argue that in a world of honor and shame, one of the worst things you can do is draw attention to yourself as someone the people are giving honor to, because it threatens those who have that honor. We think, in our culture, fame is a social good, right? Automatically. In their culture, fame is immediately suspect. If you're famous, basically, those who have honor positions, because honor is social approval, they look at them and go, you fooled a bunch of people, haven't you? That's the way they see it. Who have you fooled to get all these people to follow you? Because everyone knows they should follow me. Yeah. So it's very competitive, the honor game. Very strong in honor culture. So they're threatened, and Jesus knows that they're threatened, which may be one of the reasons why he basically says, and you see this throughout, you see it in the Gospels, that they, in the Synoptics, they gather stones and they're going to stone him, and he walks away. In John's narrative world, Jerusalem is the place that's dangerous for Jesus. When he's in Galilee, everything's fine. But boy, every time he comes to Jerusalem, and it happens over and over again, there's a threat against him. And it just builds and builds and builds. By the time you get to the seventh sign, whenever he raises Lazarus from the dead, the leaders go, we got to kill this man. All right. So John is setting up a conflict, tension between the religious leaders, both the Pharisees, Sadducees, and John even, the baptizer, and Jesus. And it's a threat to Jesus because he's becoming famous. We'll see it again. We'll see it later in the story of feeding the 5,000. He feeds the 5,000, and they want to make him to be Messiah, and he runs away. He gets away from them. He's trying to get away from these people. So in our world, a crowd's a good sign. In their world, a crowd's a bad sign. Rome, if Rome found a big crowd gathering, threat. What's going on here? We've got to put this down, disperse the crowd. One other thing, and then I'm done. I don't know how reliable this tradition is, but to me it's equally intriguing. And I mentioned this in the book. One scholar has pointed out that it was believed that Solomon, who built the temple, had magical powers. Have you ever wondered why the Masons admire Solomon so much? Y'all familiar with the Masons and that group? And yeah, so there's this idea that architecture somehow reveals some sort of otherworldly power. So they're fascinated about the pyramids and all this kind of stuff. All right. So it goes back to Solomon, and the Jewish writings about Solomon say this. I'll just cut to the chase. They say that when Solomon built the temple, God gave him power to build a sanctuary that had magical powers. And that when he set up the Ark of the Covenant, the very seat of God, when God sits on his throne, he put it on top of a rock that covered the primordial waters that once flooded the whole earth by Noah. That's the legend. So he capped the primordial waters that threatened to destroy humanity. So that as long as the temple stands, the people are safe because of Solomon's genius. So here we have a well and Jesus sits on the rock. And some scholars hear an echo even of that there's this sense that he is indeed more than a son of something greater than Solomon's here. He is indeed the well, the primordial well that is eternal life. So turning it from a destructive threat to a promise of eternal life. Is that too much? So, but then the scholars do that. I mean, they run with it. They go, oh man, are there resonances here with that, with the legend of Solomon? Because remember, in the Synoptic Gospel, it shows up, especially in Matthew, the only people that call Jesus son of David, Solomon, you're a son of David, are the ones looking for a miracle. So the Jewish legend about Solomon is that he had magical powers. That he could cast out demons and even maybe had powers over the unseen world. That's pure speculation, right? That's not in our text. That's pure speculation. Y'all hear me? But you go, One wonders if the water's splashing around all over the place, because there sure is a lot of talk. But we do hear echoes, I think. There's undeniable echoes of Genesis 24, what we just read. Wow, it's 5 till. I rambled on and on. I'm sorry. I wanted to get farther along in this. Do you have any? I will entertain a question and I'll try to answer it in a minute. That's laughable, isn't it? But I'd try. Anybody have a question about this? See you next time.
What will we cover
Oh.
next week?
We're going to cover the rest of this chapter.